Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sam Nova program with your host, Ed Samuel. I'm Kim Kennedy, welcoming you, and we're so glad that you're joining us. Ed, good morning. How are you today?
Very good, Kim.
What are we going to be talking about on the program today?
Hey, the biggest mistakes people make with their resumes.
Okay, and I've been there and done that, Ed. And I'm so grateful for a second and a third pair of eyes when people look at it and say, did you miss this? Did you see this? So it's always good to have other people analyze what you're doing with your resume. And we're going to talk about that in more detail.
Yes, we are. So let's we'll get at it. A resume should truly represent the very, very best of what you've accomplished in your work and your career. It should really speak to your top competencies, who you want the marketplace really to know you for. And a lot of people don't know is that resume has about 7 seconds worth of life when a recruiter or a hiring manager or someone takes a look at it at quick glance. When I was leading a team of recruiters, literally I gave that team of recruiters 7 seconds to make a decision. And these are experts in the field, and that's what they do for a living. I've also heard that a goldfish has a higher attention span, about 9 seconds. So we could always talk to the goldfish, I guess. But that resume has to really work, and that first page of a resume is the one that I'm most concerned about, because that first page is the one where those 7 seconds, most of those 7 seconds will take place, and it has to be a home run. So I'm going to be talking about what I truly believe the biggest mistakes made when it comes to resumes, with a couple of twists and turns. This whole subject of resume and how to write a resume and how to really do it well, it could be a 4-hour seminar all by itself. And that's how important it is that we focus on this topic. In addition, today I'm going to have a guest joining us in the studio. He's a plant and operations leader of 30 plus years with a firm in Delaware and Maryland, and he'll be telling us what happened when he found himself in a job search after 30 some years with one company and the challenges he faced with his resume. So we'll hear from him in a little bit. So let's get at it with resume mistakes. So here's number one. This is what a lot of people don't really think about, but it's a concern of mine. Take your home address off the resume. And the reason for that is, back in the old days, you would put their home address on because they would print it out and carry it to an employment office or to a potential employer, fill out an application, leave the resume there, and that's where it sits. But with today's social media, I'm not a big fan of people's picture being out on LinkedIn, Facebook, and then their resume is sent somewhere, and the next thing you know, thousands of people have your resume with a picture they can connect it to, and they know exactly your apartment number and your home address and where you live. There's no reason for that. I think a city zip code is all you need, and no recruiter, no employer in the world is going to say, well, I'm not going to bring you in for an interview because I don't know the exact apartment number you live at. So take that home address off the resume. Now, another big mistake is that avoid long paragraphs and lists on a resume. Resume should be easy to read, not tiny print, but easy to read. 8, 10 lines on a resume right at the beginning. It looks like a book. Most recruiters, I would tell you 95%, won't even read it. They're just glancing. So you have to have it very tight, very crisp summary. You want to be able to let people know years of experience, your industry focus, just a few lines about you. But the same thing goes for competencies. I've seen resumes with competencies, really with a list of 30 competencies on the first page. And everyone's trying to be everything for everybody, and that's really not the point of a resume. A resume is intended to be the very best of who you are, and those competencies should be really narrowed down to those top 20%, the things that you're really, really good at, but not a list. I actually met one person one time, but every job he applied for, he said I'd have that competency, and he'd add it to his resume, and he literally had 35 competencies on the first page of the resume, and his resume went from 3 to 4 plus pages long because every job he interviewed for or applied for, he added a competency to his resume. And some people think that that's okay, and it's absolutely not okay. So keep your competencies really at the really focus on that 20% that you're really, really good at. And most importantly, stay away from long paragraphs and lists. Now, another resume mistake is that people use way too many what I call fluff words and unnecessary words. Now, fluff words for me is that, highly energetic, good listener, I'm a team player, I'm highly successful, I'm highly effective, I'm a driver. And you get to a point where there's so many fluff words, they lose their meaning. In fact, some applicant tracking systems now, when you submit a resume with that many fluff words, there's a fluff meter somewhere, and your resume will actually get rejected simply because you put too many fluff words in. So narrow it down. Try to focus on a couple of things that you're really good at. The other word that is on resumes a lot is the word successfully. I successfully implemented. I successfully led. I successfully did. And everything in your resume should be successful. So there's no need to put the word successful, because there's a case where you're putting really unnecessary words on a resume. Just say I led, I implemented. Get that word successful off a resume, because everything on a resume really needs to be successful. Now, here's probably one of the biggest ones of all where a mistake is made. When I look at a resume, the first thing I'm looking for on that first page is an ROI. That ROI is a return on investment, and I have to be able to sense that from that first page of the resume. And that ROI is really your value proposition. I recently put a tweet out on Twitter, and I said, looking at a resume with no value proposition is like looking at a dead chicken with no feathers. It's not doing anything for me at all. You almost want to be able to get a sense of what a person's salary should be by looking at that first page of a resume and getting that quantifiable value, that ROI. And that, again, all we have is that 7 seconds. Now, this whole area of an ROI and a value proposition on a resume, last year, I think, or a year before, I spent 90 minutes at a seminar just talking about how to quantify and how to create a value proposition on a resume. But let me give you some examples. So one is, if you increase productivity, by how much? If you taught classes, how many? If you reduce risk, by how much? If you grew revenue, by what percent? If you increase market share, by what percent? Many people will just leave that blank or not quantify it at all. And at that point, for the average person who's looking at it, well, it sounds like it's zero to me, and it sounds like it's activity, and you really want to hone in on a value proposition by quantifying things. Now, I've heard concerns like, Ed, I can't remember. But it's funny, when I start asking questions to people tend to remember more than what they think. Because if you taught classes, and that's what's on your resume, I might ask the question, well, did you do more than one class a year? And someone would say yes. I said, do you do one class a month? Well, absolutely. So is there a good chance you did 12 a year? Well, yeah, probably, Ed. Well, and that's close enough, but we started out with zero. So remember, when it comes to, this whole notion of quantification, you need to really just think it through and come up with a really conservative estimate. Now, when it comes to your career, you really need to tell a story based on the career field that you're in. If you're in marketing, you need to know how many new products you introduced. You need to know how much revenue did you impact? What was the market share increase? But, how many new brands did you introduce? What were the benchmarks that you set? And again, if you're in the marketing career, these are just basic fundamentals that people are looking at in terms of their value proposition that you bring to the table when it comes to your resume. And every career is like that. Whether you're in sales, whether you're a scientist, whether you're a chemist, whether you're in healthcare, whether you're in customer service, all those careers, there's a value proposition, but be very careful that your value proposition is not quantified, because if it's not quantified, there is no ROI. And then it just looks like a lot of activities on a resume. So be really careful that you spend time creating an ROI for that first page, especially on your resume. Now, here's one of the challenges. This is why people don't have ROIs on their resume. A lot of people, when they're working, and I'm one of them, when I was working in corporate America, I could work for a boss, I could work for a company, and I said, well, let's put together, I need to put together a monthly report, a quarterly report. And I would have bosses that would just look at me and say, no, we don't do that here. Not needed. And I would be kind of scratching my head thinking, okay, but I did it anyway. Quite honestly, I did it anyway. And I sent it to my bosses, and they were a little perturbed. But after a while, they started liking it. And next thing you know, they were summarizing it and sending some of the notes to their boss. But even if my boss took that email and just threw it in the trash, I was keeping a record of what I was doing. In fact, when I was at work, and what I suggest to everyone who's working and those who are going back to work, take time to quantify what you've done on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, because you will be surprised at some point that's going to come back to bless you in all, multiple ways. And for those bosses that you've had in those companies to say, well, it's not part of our culture to document what you do, what you accomplish in any quantifiable way, that's self-serving for the company you're working for, but it hurts you in the end, because if that very company turns around and taps you on the shoulder some Friday and says, this is your last day of employment, nobody will remember the fact that your boss and that company told you not to quantify any of the value that you created while you were there at that company. Very important that you do it for yourself. Even if you have to keep private notes and send a monthly report to yourself, it will come back to bless you so many ways. In fact, when I did a monthly report or a quarterly report, I always had one goal in mind. Could I justify my salary times 3 on a quarterly basis? And if I couldn't, I would always worry about getting tapped on that shoulder, because I want to make sure I'm paying for myself. Forget about my boss and what the company thinks. Is my output enough to justify why they're paying me what they're paying me? So there's another inherent value in terms of why you would want to do that.
So we're going to shift gears now and have a discussion this morning with a former client and a friend of ours. His name is Richard Buckingham. Rich, it's great to see you again. Thanks for coming into our studio to spend a few minutes with us this morning.
Good to see you again too, Ed.
Rich, so let's kind of kick things off by just telling us a little bit about yourself and your career up until the point you lost your job.
Okay. I had gone to WL Gore and Associates in 1978. And it's interesting, having told my story a few times now, I often feel like I need to say that it wasn't just a good experience, it was beyond my wildest dreams. I started there as a hands-on maintenance mechanic, and by the last few years, I worked as part of global operations teams in multiple divisions, led several plants as a regional operations leader. So just an absolutely wonderful experience. But in early 2016, the opportunity came up. Gore was offering an enhanced retirement package, and I accepted that and decided to test the water a bit for the next part of my life. From there, I went over to a relatively small wiring harness company in New Jersey, spent about a year there, thought that wasn't quite the right match, and today I'm with a company over in Avondale, QFix, that happens to be the world leader in positioning devices for radiology treatment.
Beautiful. Rich, so when you entered the job market, when you left Gore and took that early retirement package, how did you approach creating and updating your resume? Was it easy? Was it hard?
So I thought that my writing skills were a strength at the time. So I created my own resume and started I posted that on some websites. I started applying for some jobs and really felt as though that my job at that point was to find my next job. As part of the enhanced retirement package, there was outplacement help, so I worked with a service that was provided, and they helped me create a resume. But frankly, by the end of that process, I felt as though my resume was probably just as good as theirs. I did utilize that resume. I put it out onto the internet. I applied to a few places utilizing that and wasn't successful. So I switched, went back to my old resume, and again, continued the process. I did have a couple of phone screens with the resume that I had written, but it was difficult. It was emotionally draining, trying to think about how to market myself.
Well, so Richard, how did you and I ever connect?
So as I recall, anyway, it was at an executive networking meeting, and you happened to be there. And I think it was the second one that I had attended that we actually did more of an introduction and got to know one another. And just listening to some of your ideas on how to approach marketing yourself and telling your story, I'd asked if you'd be willing to work with me to create a resume and to help me to really understand what I needed to do to be successful.
You know, as we started working together, if you can recall, you know, we started reconstructing your resume. What were you thinking at the time? Were you saying, you know, hey, this career coach is crazy, or were we doing something a little bit different?
Yes and yes. So Ed, your approach was very different. I remember one of the things that you said to me early on was that one of the problems someone like me had is I already have my own ideas on how to market it, but actually I'm not a marketing professional and I'm not someone who's lived your life and career. So the people who've been successful accepted your coaching and did what you suggested that we do. And I told myself that I was going to succumb to that and accept you as my coach and follow along as the player. That was fantastic. The other thing that you pointed out almost immediately when you looked at my resume was that I listed lots of activities, but there was no return on investment. What's the ROI? So what was the value of all of these activities to my employers? And I started thinking about it. And particularly in my time at Gore, we did so many things as teams and didn't always measure very specifically that outcome numerically. I struggled a bit, and through your questioning, very quickly, we came up with where there had been savings, where there had been improvements to businesses and those kinds of things. And because it was all, like the path that you led me down, I could speak to that with authority and confidence.
Super. You know, when we got done with your resume, when we finished it, what did you do next?
So what I did was I went back onto the internet. I posted my new resume. I continued to apply, and one of the most interesting things was the company that I ended up going to over in New Jersey that I mentioned gave me a call. I went over for some interviews. I ended up getting that job as the operations manager, and the person I reported to, the chief operating officer, told me at one point the reason why they were interested in me was because they saw that first resume that I turned in, and they really weren't interested or impressed. And when I turned in the second one, they said, if this guy works that hard to continuously improve, to look at the difference between that first one and the second one, that's a person we want in our company. Wow,
that's a great part of the success story. Now, so this improved resume, how did it then ultimately start to transform how you approach talking to people and ultimately your current job?
So the two big things that stand out to me is just getting over that hump of feeling conceited about talking about myself in some way. It feels a little embarrassing and uncomfortable. But as you said to me at one point, Ed, what some of the best advice was, never lie. Tell your story, but never make something up. Never lie, because it'll end up biting you sooner or later, which I don't think I would have done that anyway, but it was still good advice. And so being able to talk to myself confidently and truthfully, then I made the move of realizing that the commute over to the company in New Jersey was more than I wanted to do. Gosh, 295 coming into 95 over Delaware Memorial Bridge on Fridays was very difficult. Right? And so I utilized that same resume. I did update for the company in New Jersey, added that, and applied this time for companies that were closer to my home to cut down on that commute. And so within a few months, ran across the company that I'm with now. They invited me in. There were multiple interviews. But really, at that point, I knew what I was doing. I still felt confident, could speak confidently about what I'd done without feeling embarrassed or shy about it, because it was true. I had done those things.
Well, that's great, Rich. I appreciate you coming in and sharing a bit of your story. I know we could talk for a long time based on the things that we went through. I can't thank you enough for coming in and sharing your resume story with us and giving the listeners a little bit more food for thought on how important a quality resume is. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ed.
Now, another common reason people tell me they don't want to put an ROI on a resume, other than they can't remember, is, I don't want to brag, Ed. That's bragging, Ed. If I tell people, I did this, I did that, it comes across as bragging, and I beg you, it's not bragging in any way, shape, or form, because it's a fact. If you grew revenue by 50% and you grew revenue by $1 million, that's a fact. Now, where we get into bragging is when we start talking to people and we puff our chest out and we say, well, let me tell you, this is what I did. Well, see, how you'd say it is very different than just the facts. The facts is what should be on a resume, and that's what people are looking for when they're looking for your ROI. Now, for those people that are working today, listening to this show, I would promise, or I beg you to update your resume while you're working. One of the biggest mistakes made is people think, hey, I'm going to be here forever. And I could come up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people I've worked with who have made that statement, and they've gotten tapped on the shoulder and they say, Ed, I wish I had updated my resume as every couple of years, every year I update it. I'm ready to go just in case that happens. It's a big mistake. And I really urge people to do that on an ongoing basis for their own protection in case something does happen, and things can happen.
Ed, can I ask if you include letters of commendation from clients or from your superiors?
Not on a resume.
Okay.
Letters of accommodations, those are nice things to have when we get to a point where references are required, but not attached to a resume. Just like at the end of a resume, do not put your references at the bottom of a resume. That's very much old school, outdated, and it kind of dates you immediately if you do that on a resume. Leave it alone. So one of the things I like to do is let's just talk about a few takeaways from this discussion, things to avoid, biggest mistakes made. So number one, don't put that home address on your resume, whether it be apartment number, street number, city, zip code's okay, but take that home address off. That's one takeaway. Number two, really avoid long paragraphs, long lists. Something that's, 8, 10 lines long is just way too long. And if you start listing competencies, listing a long set of things that you're good at, try to shrink that back down to the top 20% of what you're really, really good at. And keep that summary of who you are very tight. Number three takeaway, stay away from fluff words. Stay away from those unnecessary words. Words like highly energetic, highly successful. Those words are just filling up space. And most people who are looking at it, interviewing, and they're looking for the value proposition. They're assuming that you have energy. That's why you're applying for the job. You don't need to state the obvious, and you certainly don't need to state the obvious that things are successful on your resume. Item number 4, have an ROI on the first page of your resume. Quantify your accomplishments. Try to do it while you're working. And if you're going back to work, start doing it when you get back to work. Regardless of the company culture, or if your boss looks you right in the eye and says, I don't need a monthly report. Trust me, you need a monthly report. Even if you send it to yourself, just make sure it's quantified. Now, as we close today, if you want your resume reviewed at no cost, please send your resume to me. Send it to resume@samnovainc.com. That's resume@samnovainc.com. On our next program on Optimize Your Career on Saturday, July 21st, we'll discuss the importance of bringing out the strengths of your personality during an interview and how to go about assessing it, preparing, and weaving it into your story in a very assertive way. Very important, and something, again, that's not done that often, is the strength of your personality. This, again, is Ed Samuel, career coach with Sam Nova. Our website is www.samnovainc.com. That's SAMNOVAINC.com. If you'd like to reach me with a question, comment, you can email me at esamuel@samnovainc.com or call our number at 610-274-8214. Make it a great weekend. So long for now, and God bless.